All right, so we're going to talk today about testing syllogisms by counterexamples. And I'll just say right off the bat, this is my least favorite thing in this book, okay? And this is my least favorite thing because I, like many of you, love rules. I love boxes and clearly defined lines and boundaries. And so I'll tell you just a little sneak preview. We're going to talk about how to test syllogisms by rules next week. And that's my favorite thing in this entire book. But counterexamples are difficult because they require a little bit of creativity. And I'm not very creative. So for some of you who love to be creative and have felt stifled all semester, then counterexamples are going to be your jam. For those of you who are rule followers like me, you're going to have to work with counterexamples for the next week or so, and then we can kind of leave them behind. But we do need to understand what they are. So take some notes down as we go. When we test by counterexample, we are substituting terms, okay? We're substituting terms. Now just remember this. We've already done it. We have already done testing by counterexample. And we did it last week when we talked about this syllogism right here. All birds are creatures with eyes. All birds are egg layers. Therefore, all egg layers are creatures with eyes. We talked about how we could substitute the term living creatures for egg layers to test for validity. Okay, so we've already done this. So we are at least a little bit familiar that this is something that you can do. So to test this syllogism, we would create a counterexample. And here's what a counterexample is. Again, you don't have to write this definition down. This is in your book. It's on your catechism. So don't try to write down every word of this. But here's a counterexample. It's a syllogism of the same form as the original. Now remember, when we are testing for validity, what we're testing for is the form of the argument. We don't care about the individual premises. We can interchange those. What we care about is this form. Is this A002 or EEI4, right? Is this a valid form? So when we test by counterexample, it's the same form, but what we do is we make the premises true and we make the conclusion false. When we test by counterexample, we make the premises true and we make the conclusion false. So in this particular example, if I substitute the word living creatures in for egg layers, it sounds like this. All birds are creatures with eyes. True or false?
True.
True. All birds are living creatures. True or false?
True.
True. Now we have there two obviously true premises. And validity tells us that if I have two true premises, what should my conclusion be?
True.
It should be true. But pay attention. If I've substituted living creatures for egg layers, my conclusion now says all living creatures are creatures with eyes. Is that
False.
true? That's false.
Jellyfish.
Yeah, jellyfish, Ben says. I don't know enough, we don't have to give specific examples, but you know that it's false. And therefore, this syllogism, this A3 is invalid. Every single AAA3 is invalid because this one is. Because the form AAA3 is not a valid argument, and we prove that by making a counterexample. Now that's substituting one term, okay? But sometimes we're going to have to change all of the terms. Sometimes we'll have to change all of the terms, and that's totally valid because it doesn't change the form of the argument. So for example, here's an argument. Some Christians are not critical thinkers. Some humanists are not critical thinkers. Therefore, some humanists are Christians. Now, the main problem that many of you would have with evaluating that argument is you don't know what a humanist is, and you don't know what a critical thinker is, and therefore you don't know if the premises are true, and you don't know, like, how do I even know? Well, the beauty of counterexamples is you can substitute every single one of those words and come up with something that you do know what they are. So, for example, how about this one? Some women are not lawyers. Some men are not lawyers. Therefore, some men are women. You know what men are, you know what women are, and you know what lawyers are. Now, what's the form of both of those syllogisms? They are both what?
No,
No.
No, it's OOI.
OOI.
3, 4,
2. Thank you, Rocco. OOI2. Yes, George.
So these are that some women are not lawyers, some men are not lawyers, therefore some men are women. That's a correct syllogism, right? Like it's a valid syllogism.
No.
Okay.
Yes, and I'm going to show you why. So what we've done, George and everybody else, is we've taken this form, OOI2. Remember, when we're checking for validity, we don't actually care if that's true or not. What we're asking is that argument itself valid? And what we've done is we've substituted the words men, women, and lawyers in for our middle, major, and minor term. Those are both OOI2. But notice, hold on a second. Let's just look at this one at a time. Is it true that some women are not lawyers?
Yes.
Yes. Is it true that some men are not lawyers?
Yes.
According to validity, if I have two true premises, what should my conclusion be?
True.
True. My conclusion says some men are women. Is that true or false?
False.
False. Therefore, this is an invalid form. Every single OOI2 in the universe is invalid. Every single OOI2 in the universe is invalid. That's the beauty of substituting terms. Ben?
Well, I was going to say, so if it was an OOO2, so it read some women are not lawyers, some men are not lawyers, therefore some men are not women. That would be true, right? Because some can mean all.
So we'll get to this next week, but just say no. That's not. Here's the danger. Here's the limitation of testing by counterexample. It can only prove it to be invalid. It can't prove it to be valid. So an OOOO is invalid for a completely different reason that we'll talk about next week. But all I want you to see right now on this particular screen is that you can evaluate arguments by substituting in terms, because what you're evaluating is the form. Yes, Ava.
Do you know how many possible combinations there are?
256. They're in the back of your book. Yeah. Yes.
So I did this last week when I didn't understand some of the terms. I
Mhm.
just switched them all out
Yes.
for things I did understand. Is that basically what we're
Yes, that's what you did it last week. Yes, so you were doing counterexamples last week. Yeah. Yes.
Could you use the same subject like a middle term or third for each one? So could you use women, lawyers, men for every single syllogism?
You could start there, but it's not always going to work. And I'll show you what I mean later. So you're going to have to be creative. Sometimes you can use, cats, rats, and dogs. But sometimes cats, rats, and dogs actually doesn't work to prove that to be invalid. So I'll show you what I mean in just a moment. All right, let's move on. Here's another one. No man is immortal. Some angels are not men. Therefore, some angels are immortal. So what's the form of that argument? Yeah. Okay. Well, stop. As disappointing as that was, it is an EOI1. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to come up with a counterexample, but has true premises and a false conclusion. And let me show you how to do that. We're going to start with an obviously false conclusion in the same form. So let's say some dogs are fish. Okay? Now that's our conclusion. Some dogs are fish. Now we know that is in fact false. Now this actually may not work. I just threw up the first two nouns I thought of. So to go back to Ava's point, sometimes the first two nouns you think of don't actually work. Now we want to have the same form. So what we're going to do is we're going to write no, and then we're going to leave this blank. Say no blank is fish. And then some dogs are not blank. Okay? Can you think of a term that I can use for my middle term that would make both of these true? George?
Could it be food?
Well, some food is fish.
Oh wait, yeah.
Sophie?
Plants.
Plants. Okay? No plants are fish. Is that true?
Yes.
Some dogs are not plants. Is that true?
Yes.
Yes. So now I have two true premises and an obviously false conclusion. Therefore, EOI1 invalid. Okay? Every single EOI1 in the universe is invalid, and we just proved it via counterexample. Now, like I said, I just threw up dogs and fish because that was the first two things I thought of. Sometimes it doesn't work. Dogs and fish may not be the right ones. You have to switch them out. But you can see the basic principle. Start with an obviously false conclusion. Let me stress, obviously false. If your conclusion is something like an inside family joke that Mr. Wood, when I read it, I don't know if it's true or false, then don't do it that way. Make your conclusion something that a 5-year-old would know. Like a 5-year-old would know that some dogs are fish is false. Okay? Like, hey, McKeever, leave. Just go. So make it so false that every single person who reads it knows automatically that is false. And make your premises so true that every single person who reads it knows automatically that's true. Okay? So let's go on. If you can't find a counterexample, right? Like, so let's say on your homework tonight, you've been working at it for like 10 minutes. One of two things is true if you can't find a counterexample. The argument is valid. Okay? Perhaps the reason you can't find a counterexample is because that is a valid argument, and the form will not allow you to have two true premises and a false conclusion because the form is valid. The other solution is that you're not being creative enough. And so this goes back to Ava's question about, can you just use men, women, and lawyers every time? Well, you could use men, women, and lawyers frequently, but likely tonight in your homework, if you decide, I'm going to use oranges, strawberries, and apples for every single one of my major, minor, and middle terms, eventually you're going to hit a point where that doesn't work. That doesn't mean the argument's valid. You might have to change up your terms. So if you can't find a counterexample, it's either valid or you're not being creative enough. Okay? And so here's the steps to work through. And we just did this, but if you want to write this down, here's what you do. Start with a false conclusion. So in other words, substitute major and minor terms that make the conclusion false. And I mean obviously, ridiculously, over-the-top false. Some dogs are fish, false. Okay? Second, write these terms into the premises and leave the middle term blank. Like I did. I wrote, no blank is fish. Some dogs are not blank. Okay? Third, find a middle term that makes both of those premises true. And if you do that, if you can do that, then you have proven that to be invalid. You can move on. George?
So is all the 266 ways you can like in the square of opposition, like are all those one or the other, or they can be both?
Every one of the 256 forms of categorical syllogisms is either valid or invalid.
Okay.
And only about 30 of them are valid. And when we're a week from now, you would be able to test all 256 and know whether they're valid or not. You don't have to, but you would be able to. Vandernoot?
So is every argument n equals to I are they invalid?
No. I will give you a little sneak preview. Every argument with two negative premises is invalid. Every EE, every OO, every EO, every OE. Every argument with two negative premises is invalid. But we'll get into those rules more next week, so don't worry about that. You don't have to know that for tonight. Yes?
Did you say there was a list of all the arguments that are valid or invalid?
There's a list of all the arguments, period.
Oh, not
Yeah.
invalid.
It is the literal last page in your book.
All right, one more. So all Paul's writings are first century compositions. Some epistles are not Paul's writings. Therefore, some epistles are not first century compositions. What is the form of that argument?
No, it's
AOO1. Okay? AOO1. Now, let's look at this. I substituted the terms students for epistles and people for first century compositions, then put those in my major and minor premise, and I left the middle term blank. Can you think of a word that I could use for my middle term that would make both of these true and leave my conclusion false? Eden? Let's think of something a little more creative than that. But George?
Fish.
Remember, the premises have to be true.
Oh, they have to be true. Dang it.
Yeah. Curran?
Children.
All right. All children are people. Is that true?
Yeah.
Some students are not children. Is that true?
Yeah.
Yes. Therefore, some students are not people. Is that true or false? False. So I got two true premises and a false conclusion. Therefore, the form A001 is invalid. Every A001 in the universe is invalid.
But you can already know it's not right?
No, I said if the premises are both negative, not the conclusion. If the premises are both negative. All right.
Wait.
Yes.
Can't you just figure it out if the conclusion just like sounds ridiculous, like some students are not people, you already know that's invalid.
No. The point of testing by counterexamples, George, is that you start with an obviously false conclusion. Okay? So the point is it has to be something false. And then you see if you could plug in a middle term. So let me show you what it would look like if you couldn't do this. All right. So let's do this one. All right. It's going to be an A1. Okay. So let's say give me an obviously false conclusion. An A. Yes.
All clocks are water.
All locks are water.
Clocks.
Clocks. Okay. All clocks are water. All right, it's an AAA1, so my first premise will say all blank are water, and then all clocks are blank. And in order to prove this to be invalid, you would have to come up with a middle term that you could use that would make these both true. So you have to think of one term that would make both the major and minor premise true and leave the conclusion false, and I'll just spoil the ending. You can't. There's no word in the universe that you could put in here and have both of these be true and leave this being false, because AAA1 is a valid argument. And so because it is valid, there is no possible counterexample. Yes?
You really can just look at that and really think that water and clocks aren't going to have any similarity.
Well, that is true, but just looking at it isn't really going to do it. You've got to be able to prove it. It's like in math class. You got to show your work, right? You got to be able to say it's valid because blah, 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 or it's invalid because blah, blah. You can't just say, I feel it in my heart, like I prayed on it, and that one's definitely invalid. You got to be able to prove it, but you can't prove it with AAA1. Okay, with an AAA1, which is a valid form of argument, every AAA1 in the universe is valid, which means there is no counterexample that's going to make this work. Okay, there is no counterexample that's going to make that work. That's the danger of counterexamples. You can spend an hour on them and be like, oh, well, I just really still don't know. All right, so here's your homework for tonight.
What are you doing? I don't know.
All right, I'm going to give you your homework. I don't want you to write anything except for your name on it right now. Don't write anything except for your name on this homework.
Wow. What did we do? What did we do?
Welcome. You're welcome. Why did you do that?
Nothing's wrong with you.
Why do you need a lot?
All right, pass those back. Put your name on it. Put your name on it, and don't put anything else on it. Put your name on it, and then put nothing else on it.
Oh, where was
This practice here says,
Put your name on it, and then don't put anything else on it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, listen to me. All right, exercise 22. It says, test the following syllogisms by counterexample. If no counterexample is possible, write valid. So if you'll flip over to the back, you'll notice that it says challenge. Do not do the challenge. Put a big old X through it. Do not do the challenge. Peter, do you have your homework? So put a big old X through it. You are not doing the challenge. You are just doing 1 through 6. Let me give you one more hint. Only one of those arguments is valid, which means you should be able to come up with a counterexample for 5 of them. And to make it even easier for you, I'm going to do the first one for you up here on the board. So the first one says, some cherubim are not angels, some angels are not seraphim, therefore all seraphim are cherubim. Okay? Exactly. What? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to substitute like this. I substituted strawberries and cherries for seraphim and cherubim. And then for the term angels, I used the middle term apples. And here's what I came up with. Some cherries are not apples. True or false?
True.
True. Some apples are not strawberries. True or false?
True.
True. Therefore, all strawberries are cherries. False. So I've got two true premises and a false conclusion. Therefore, that argument is invalid. So every single O, A, 4 in the universe is invalid. Curran?
Do your statements you have to come up with, do they have to be true? Like, I'm saying, like, if you do all, I just like a made-up word, like all.
No, you can't make up words here.
Okay.
The point of a counterexample is that you have two true premises and a false conclusion. So it's got to be like really true, not Dr. Seuss book true. It has to be like literally true. So your premises both have to be true and your conclusion has to be false. So you've got 5 left. One of them is valid. The other 4 are invalid. Okay? Ben.
Well, I was going to say, you said earlier that anyone with two negatives, like
Correct.
an A or an E or an O,
Correct.
2 of them automatically means it's invalid.
Correct.
Right? But all of these have 2.
Okay. Do all of them have 2?
No. It's all of the two of the premises.
The premises.
Oh.
The premises. And even if you know, like, so even if you saw, okay, that one has 2 negative premises, so I know it's invalid, you still have to come up with a counterexample. You still have to do the work to come up with a counterexample to prove that it's invalid. Yes?
So back to the thing with the made-up words. I always use men, women, and walkers.
And walkers.
Yeah, like they can walk.
Okay. Again, you can use whatever real words you want, but it's not that men, women, and walkers may not work for every form.
So like I could use that. Walkers.
You can use the word walkers, but you've got what you have to, I need you to hear me. What you have to end up with is 2 true premises. And I mean obviously true. So if I don't know what walkers means, okay, that's the danger. Like if you use some word that you and your buddies use to describe something being smelly, but it's not a word that I know, then it's not obviously true or obviously false. I mean, I'm talking like when I say obviously true, I mean like some cherries are not apples. Everyone knows that's true. And when I say obviously false, I mean all strawberries are cherries. Everyone knows that's false. It's got to be completely and totally obviously false, or completely and totally and obviously true. So not men, women, and lawyers isn't going to work every time. Eden?
So the conclusion always has to be when you're
When doing counterexamples, your conclusion always has to be false. That's where you start. You start with a false conclusion, and then plug in the major and minor terms into your major and minor premise, leave the middle term blank, and then think of one word that you could put in for your middle term that would leave your premises true and your conclusion false. And if you can do that, that's a valid counterexample, and the argument is invalid. Okay? Any other questions? All right, so that is due tomorrow. I know we don't have logic class tomorrow, but you'll just put it in my tray. Don't put it in my hand. Don't put it on the desk. Don't put it in my box. Don't put it on the front desk. You come in here in between some class, and you put it in the tray that you put all your other homework in there as well. All right, so you can work for the next couple of minutes, and I'll let you know when you can pack up.